Good evening, all, and welcome to another Spooky True Saturday, where you can be assured to hear only true scary stories from my own personal experiences, and supposedly true ones from people I know. Tonight, our path leads us once again down that lonely road with another trucker story. And though creepy this may be, it is, once again, a reminder that there may be something out there that watches out for the men and women that keep our stores stocked and our economy running. Now gather round, my friends, and listen well to That's a Long Way Down, partner. Due to the darker nature of this story, it might be wise to steer clear of this one if you are having a particularly rough day. Should that be the case, please take a look at my playlists of funny stories. I have two, one made up of creepy stories and ones that are not. That being said, let's begin. Jed, as we'll call him, had been a trucker for most of his career. He had pulled all continental 48 states plus Alaska and had seen many things on the road. Some funny, some disturbing, and some just plain bizarre. I very much enjoyed most of his tales, but because this one was so deeply personal for him and so haunting in general, I feel I should share it. You see, a few years before this story was told to me, Jed was having a very difficult time of it. He'd been quite a rough man in his youth. Fighting and drinking were his boon companions, and he had quite a temper for many years. This, coupled with marrying too young and too wild, meant his household was quite tumultuous. I won't get into details, nor place blame solely on one person or the other for their failed domestic life, as we all know there are three sides to every story. However, at some point during the marriage, his wife began turning to drugs. I won't get into the details, but by the time Jed grew up and started to make his amends, his wife was pretty much run by the chemicals she threw into herself. He tried to help her get clean, but nothing ever worked for long. He'd usually wind up in a fight with her, and then take on more jobs to stay away and cool down, and then have to turn around and take on more jobs because she'd drained his accounts dry, either by guilt-tripping or flat out taking whatever she could get her hands on if he left a card behind by mistake. Whenever he tried cutting her off, she'd lose her mind and find ways of tormenting him until he felt so guilty he wished he was dead. And when all you've got to look forward to is a coked-out wife who might disappear for weeks at a time, and a lonely open road, life loses every ounce of its luster. Jed finally hit rock bottom. He'd been out on another long haul somewhere in the back country, reduced to eating nothing but bologna sandwiches for several weeks because that was what was cheap, afraid to turn his phone back on because he knew his wife would be blowing it up, wanting more money because she had already went through his last couple of paychecks. At the time, he was traveling up a mountain and saw one of those overlooks. Without really thinking about it, he pulled off the road into the little semicircular parking lot and got out. It was evening, and there weren't very many people there. A trio of motorcycles, an old couple in a beat-up brown car, and some guy slightly younger than Jed in a green truck. As he got out to stretch his legs, he took notice of each group, although they paid little attention to him. The bikers were having a grand time, cutting up with each other while occasionally revving up their engines just to hear them echo across the mountainside. The old couple were steadily plodding along, side by side, with the old man's arms slung around his aged bride, while soft smiles adorned the wrinkled faces. At the far end of the overlook was the lone man, who seemed very content to take a ton of pictures of the plentiful scenery. Jed headed down the overlook a ways before noticing the photographer had stepped over the rock wall that framed the sidewalk and walked a ways out onto the cliffside. Since there were plenty of great rock shelves out there, Jed figured he would do the same. As he stepped out toward the end of one great boulder, he was suddenly aware of everything that lay before him. The mountains were fully green with summer in full swing. The trees stretched out below him like a carpet, rising and falling with the hills, dotted by the odd house here or there. A river split off and snaked its way across the woodland, and the reflected sunshine upon the channels left them glittering like ribbons of liquid light. Far off in the distance, a haze tinged the carpet of green, turning its viridescence into a misty blue as the hills evolved into mountains. When the motorcycle drivers turned off their rides to look around, Jed could hear the chirping of the songbirds and the din of the cicadas. The scene stole the very breath from his lungs. It was all so peaceful. What a word, peace. Such a feeling had long since deserted him, to the point it had become a foreign thing, forgotten like his earliest memories. Now that he had finally experienced that long-lost feeling again, the ache nearly ripped him apart. There was no going back to before. No, there hadn't been much of a before to start. He didn't want to go back to how he knew he was, and how angry he was at the world. Though, now that he thought of it, he knew he was still angry at the world, just in another way. Or so he had been. Recently, he found himself being less and less angry, and more desperate. Only one thought consumed him, and everything he had done to achieve it had failed. He just wanted it all to stop. It was, at that moment, a thought struck him. There was a way he could make it stop. A sure way. He stepped a bit closer to the edge of the rock shelf, almost rocking back with the vertigo of seeing just how sheer the fall was. He looked around at the others on the overlook. The photographer was now chatting with the bikers, and the old couple were getting in their car to leave. No one noticed him. Jed turned back to the drop. One of the worst tragedies in his life had been hearing his best friend had taken his own life. He had been Jed's best drinking buddy, a loyal and dependable man, quick with a joke and an incredibly hard worker. Behind the grin he flashed at others, however, Jed knew the man was fighting his own demons. He'd caught him on somber days, where the very air seemed to rob the other man of his words. The blow had hit Jed hard, and he'd never really had the chance to recover from it. Looking down from the overlook, Jed wondered, did it hurt? Would a tumble from the cliff be worse than the way his friend went out? What would it feel like to just feel the ground give way beneath him? As his thoughts drifted, his resolution grew. Slowly, Jed inched toward the edge, crouching down, sitting down on the rock face, scooting ever closer toward the edge. It was like a game he played with his mother when he knew he was pushing his luck. Don't come into the kitchen, but come as close as possible just to grate on Mom's nerves without actually breaking the rules. He felt a rush of fear, but strange elation as well. This was it. He could leave it all behind. No more being torn apart on a daily basis. Just a little more. That's a long way down, partner. Jed was honestly surprised that the voice behind him didn't scare him right off the cliff. Instead, it caused him to actually flinch backwards, and he turned around. Standing behind him was a big, burly old cowboy. He was very tall, with his white cowboy hat standing a stark contrast to his dark skin. His whiskers were more peppered with white than black, and he spoke with a drawl that was clearly from the deep south. The man smiled at him before waving back toward the retaining wall. "Why don't you come back this ways? That's a pretty steep bluff. You don't want to take a wrong step off it, do you?" Jed wasn't sure why, but he felt like the man could see right through him. Like he knew that Jed wasn't just out there for a dangerously close look at the scenery out of sheer stupidity. Normally, Jed might have told him to mind his own business. But there was something about this fellow that was so warm and grandfatherly that he figured there wasn't much harm in talking to him. After all, there were other overlooks, other ways. But Jed never wound up needing those other ways. You see, after Jed walked over to the old cowboy, the man gestured for him to sit on the wall with him. They chatted over much of nothing for a bit, it seemed, mostly the old man making comments about the scenery and the drive up the mountains. At some point, the conversation changed over, and it went from Jed interjecting his opinion on this or that to him pretty much being the conversation. Before he knew it, he was pouring out the bile that had been building up within him for years, spilling the tale of his woes in a way that he hadn't to anyone besides his best friend. By the time he was done, Jed felt strangely better. I don't recall what else was said, but during the following conversation, the man helped Jed figure out a few things with himself and give him an idea of what was going on. Of how his own guilt had been eating at him because he hadn't forgiven himself for all the times he verbally lashed out at his wife. Of how he hadn't been around to save his friend. Of how he felt he had gotten himself stuck and was beating himself up over that. In the end, Jed felt a lot better than before and started to assess the situation in a clearer light than he had in months. The old cowboy stood and asked Jed to come back over onto the sidewalk so he could get back onto the road now that he was feeling better. As Jed had just gotten into his truck, he realized he had forgotten to thank the man or even got his name. He opened the door and stood, preparing to call out to the man when he realized the old cowboy wasn't there. In fact, there was not even a vehicle nearby besides his rig, the green truck, and the 3 motorcycles from before. The parking lot was fairly wide, and Jed would easily have seen the man if he had walked up there. Where had he gone? Jed got out and walked over to the photographer and bikers, asking them if they had seen the man. None of them had, nor had they seen anyone matching his description arrive or leave. One of the bikers had vaguely noticed Jed going out onto the rock and then later him sitting on the wall, but not with anyone else around. They also hadn't seen any vehicle pull in since Jed had. The whole thing left the trucker scratching his head. It wasn't until he was back on the road that the pieces fell together, which left him pulling off the road for a whole different reason. He'd never been a religious man, but that mysterious old cowboy made him wonder if there really were such beings as angels out there on the open road. Well, my friends, I hope you all enjoyed this story. This is one of my darker, more somber stories considering the subject, so it's one that I hope helps more than entertains. After all, being stuck alone with nothing but miles of endless road between you and your destination can leave you to your own thoughts. And if those thoughts aren't healthy thoughts, then you can become a prisoner of your own mind. I imagine there's a few more truckers out there with cases like Jed. And while I don't know if you'll wind up with some strange old cowboy coming out of the woodwork to talk you down, I do want you to know this. There are ways out of whatever you are going through that aren't so horribly absolute. It will get better for you, just as it did for Jed. Get help, and don't let your demons eat you alive. At least, make them work for it. Don't just hand them the salt and say how to season yourself just right. Gotta leave something for the cannibal clowns out there, am I right? I'd be forever grateful if you would like and share this video. Same way for those who subscribe, and check out my Patreon at patreon.com/Phantasmal Poppy. And hit the notification bell to catch your latest spooky fix the moment it comes out. Good night, and see you all real soon.